It's all in your head. You don't look sick. Your tests are normal. It's probably anxiety. There's nothing wrong with you. Have you heard these words from physicians, family, and friends? If you're someone who has been struggling and swirling through the revolving door of healthcare to find answers about your health, or if you know someone who is going through this experience, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast with Laura Nozica, a show dedicated to exploring the challenges of living with undiagnosed or rare medical conditions. This podcast explores both sides of the bedside. We will be speaking with patients who have had challenges with finding a diagnosis, along with experts in the field. I'm your host, Laura Nozica. Please note I am not a medical professional, nor am I affiliated with any healthcare, pharmaceutical, or device company. I am an entrepreneur, and I am an independent market researcher focused on helping healthcare organizations better understand the patient perspective. The podcast is not meant to offer medical advice, but to merely share the stories and perspectives of podcast guests. Hello, and welcome to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. I am your host, Laura Nozica, and I've got a really cool show coming up here with a really cool guest. And this is kind of a unique episode for me, and talking about something that really is near and dear to me, having a background in healthcare and hospital marketing and communications. I got to thinking that this guest would be perfect to have this conversation with. And I am here today with Kelly Leonard, and I will let you know all about him. But a lot of you are also familiar with Second City here in Chicago. So keep all that in mind as I go through Kelly's bio here. Kelly Leonard is the Vice President of Creative Strategy, Innovation, and Business Development at the Second City, again, here in Chicago. His book, Yes and, was published to critical acclaim by HarperCollins. Kelly has spoken at Aspen Ideas Festival, Microsoft, Twitter, TEDx Broadway, and has guest lectured at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He also has a podcast, and it's called Getting to Yes and for WGN Radio. For over 20 years, he oversaw Second City's live theatrical divisions, working with such talent as, ready everybody? Tina Fey, Stephen Colbert, Amy Poehler, Seth Meyers, Keegan-Michael Key, and others here in Chicago, and some of those old-time comics that, maybe I can get Kelly to tell us a story or two at the end. He and his wife, Ann Libera, were awarded the Creative Voice Award in 2019 by the Arts Alliance in Illinois. Thank you, Kelly, for being here. And some of you may remember that I co-hosted Uncorking a Story, which is a podcast with my friend Michael Carlin. That's his podcast. And we co-hosted with Kelly, I think a couple of years ago now. Kelly, thanks for being here. It's so nice to see you again.
It's great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Kelly, since we haven't seen each other in a while, Kelly, just tell me what's been going on since we last talked.
I mean, what hasn't been going on? I mean, do you just want to talk about this week? It is my standard since COVID, I think, has been when people ask me how I'm doing, I'm like, everything's great, everything's terrible. How are you?
Yeah.
It's honestly, that's the way it feels. It's very up and down. So Second City, obviously COVID, I mean, we almost lost the place. And that was like the second time in the last few years where that was the case.
Wow.
But made it through, but then we got sold. And that's the first time that's happened since I've been here. And only the second time in the history of Second City. But we were bought by a private equity company called ZMC. And we got a new CEO, and we came out of COVID, and we attempted to open up the theater, and that was hard. That was not easy. And then we had to rebuild. I mean, even though Second City didn't go away, so many people were gone, and so many of the traditions that made up the work we do were suddenly not as easy to sort of grab as they were before. So it took a level of intention that I don't think any of us who've worked here for very long, and there's only a few of us left, we just took it so much for granted. And the cool part about that was we literally, one of the projects that I worked on with my wife, Ann, who's also a longtime Second City creative executive, is we did a self-study. We basically wrote it down. What is it? What is the creative ecosystem at Second City? How does it work? What does our training hope to accomplish? When we work with corporate clients, what's our POV? Literally a 46-page document about here's how we do creative, with the caveat, of course, that we're always open to change, and different ideas and different ways to get there. But let's understand why we're changing or what we're changing from. And so, there's this sort of reinvention that we all had to do, of the business, I think of ourselves, as well, in working with the new teams. And then it's the sort of, all the incredibly rich and interesting opportunities that cross our door at Second City, and I'm really proud of the work that's going on stage right now. And I find myself in I do a lot of public speaking and then a lot of workshops and other things. So working with everyone from the Gates Foundation, to I just worked with an international conglomerate yesterday. We did a morning session with them with people from all over the world, and it was the night after the big Copa soccer championship. And so all the Argentinians were wearing their Argentinian jerseys, and they're infuriating their Colombian friends who lost in that game. But it was actually, and there was multiple translators in the room, and I was with my co-facilitator who is bilingual. But man, if this group responded so well to the improvisational principles that we're putting in front of them about how to navigate change and how to be agile and how to be resilient and all the things that one needs, not just to navigate everyday life and business, but certainly these healthcare settings that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Those are all vital skills, and the thing is, they can be practiced. And I think that's a missing link for a lot of people. Is there's always that assumption, especially in the creative areas, where people are like, well, they either got it or they don't. You can either do it or you can. And it's like, that's not the case. People can learn these things, and also these skills can atrophy if you don't practice.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, okay, so how does this all tie into healthcare and the premise of my show? But I have Kelly here to tell us more about improv. And I think most people are familiar with improv in the context of comedy. And we know that there's really nothing funny about healthcare for the most part. There are some comical moments within healthcare. And having worked for many of the healthcare systems in the city myself, there's always some fodder for laughter, because sometimes that you have to in that kind of setting. But Kelly has managed to create a very special approach to communications within the healthcare setting using improv. And we're going to talk more about that with him today. And I think we can all agree that the healthcare setting, for one, is a really hard place to work in these days. I love hospital culture, but it is a tough place to be, tougher even before when I left, I don't know, some 10 years ago, left to do other things and work for myself, but still in the healthcare setting. For me, healthcare is like I hate to say it, it's like a train wreck I can't keep my eyes off of, because it's so fascinating and ever changing. And for all the work that I've done in the market research space on behalf of healthcare and pharmaceutical companies, and having interviewed patients and doctors for so many years, and hearing so many sad stories about how, well, my doctor, I really felt dismissed, and I had all these symptoms, and the doctor wasn't hearing me, and I know he wasn't listening, and I think he thinks I'm crazy, and all these things. And thinking about how there has to be a better way for this patient healthcare communication to take place. And you've got some other special approaches for people who are caregivers of family members, et cetera. So your approach spans all of that. Kelly, I'd love to learn more about how this Improv for Healthcare program started and how it works and who's been a part of it. I just think it's so cool, and the outcomes that you've seen.
Yeah. Like all good stories, this one kind of starts with a fire.
Yeah.
Second City caught on fire.
I think that's
Uh,
the name of your next book, right? Is
it
it
might
the
be. It
next
might
book?
be. Slightly before that, I had written the book Yes and was out helping promote it, and it was doing really well, and things were changing at the theater, and I'd been here a very long time, and I think I was changing too, and the combination of all these things, I was like, I think it's maybe time for me to do something different. And I wasn't sure if I was going to do that at Second City or outside of Second City, but my boss at the time sort of said, "Why don't you stay for a year and figure out if you can find a bridge in or a bridge out?" Moved me to this new office. I went on vacation and I got a text from my colleague Nate who said, "Your office is on fire." And I work at Second City, so I'm assuming he's joking. He absolutely wasn't. He absolutely was not. The fire, it was a grease fire. It started at this upscale Spanish restaurant that was right below my new office. So I mean, I lost everything. I have one shelf behind me that has like the four things that we saved from the fire, and we got put in these temporary offices. But there was sort of a gift to this because I didn't know what I was going to do next, and suddenly I was unburdened by everything. I didn't have files. I didn't have anything that was sort of pointing me towards what I would do next, and I sort of quickly had a couple of ideas, and one of the things that I ended up landing on was a partnership that happened at the University of Chicago. It ended up being called the Second Science Project, and it started that year. And my partner Heather Caruso, who was at that point running the one of the labs over at the Booth School of Business, the Center for Decision Research, she and I cooked up this thing with my wife Anne that looked at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation and vice versa. So it was a 5-year lab. It was a bunch of scientists, behavioral scientists, some really top-notch folks, a bunch of Second City improvisers. We created executive education programs, orientation programs. We did studies and went on every single week. And we were in these temporary offices at the time that this was happening. And I got a call from Adam Grant. So many of you might know Adam. He's a Wharton professor and a best-selling author. And Adam is one of these guys. I think I've been interviewed for 3 or 4 of his books. I've never ended up in a book. But a lot of his research is, and one of his books is called Give and Take. And
not yet, Kelly, not yet.
Yeah, not yet. But part of the premise of the Give and Take book is that givers tend to do better than takers, which was a message that resonated with me. And he said, "Hey, my friend Ai-jen Poo is moving to Chicago. She doesn't know anyone. Would you take her to lunch?" And me like, "Yeah, of course I will." And I was really busy at the time, and I didn't do any research on this person, Ai-jen, which was like maybe not smart, but didn't matter in the long run because we sat down for lunch and I just said, "Do you want to hear about my day?" And she said, "Yeah." And I'd just come from this amazing session where we're using improvisation, fueled by these sort of behavioral science insights, and many of which were about how we actually see one another or don't see one another. And we were creating exercises that would allow people to practice the ability to see someone more effectively and to be seen more effectively. And Ai-jen is like leaning in. And for those who might not know this incredible human who is now one of my best friends, Ai-jen Poo, MacArthur Genius grantee, runs a couple organizations, Caring Across Generations and the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She's also part of the group Supermajority with Alicia Garza and Cecile Richards. And her work is about these caregivers and how we give voice to people who are voiceless, to great numbers of people who aren't counted as numbers. They're not in the GNP because I guess it doesn't matter, even though it's the only thing that matters in terms of, yeah. So Ai-jen immediately is like, caregivers need your work. And I'm like, yeah, that checks the box. And so we started collaborating and working with her organization, and we ended up presenting at Aspen Ideas Festival, where Ai-jen and her team were curating the sort of health week before the regular festival started up. We were one of our workshops was attended by a woman at the Cleveland Clinic, Ruth Allman, and she ended up funding a program that we built with Cleveland Clinic and Caring Across Generations called Improvisation for Caregivers. And it was basically using these practices, many of which are fueled by behavioral science, which allow people practice in how they might provide care, not just for each other, but also for themselves. Placing less burden on ourselves and on others, freeing ourselves of judgment of self and judgment of others, how we tell our stories and how we tell them more effectively. Good quick example. In many of our storytelling workshops at Second City, we use an exercise called 60-30-10. And that's where we say, speak to someone about an accomplishment that you achieved. You're going to do it in 60 seconds. Then you're going to do it in 30 seconds. Then you're going to do it in 10 seconds. And it's really about how do we hone our messaging when we have time and when we don't. And how do we take that 60-minute story and distill it into the most important 10 seconds? Because maybe that's all the time we have with someone.
Yep.
And then, so that's one thing as a speaker, but then as a listener, also you're able to sort of craft and listen, like, how am I listening for what's important? And in doing the exercise with a partner, you can help each other in terms of honing those stories. So it's many of those kinds of things that they're actually fun exercises to do. They're playful. They're often low stakes, but they are also really useful in high stakes environments. So that's how we got on this train of starting to work with the caregiving communities.
Yeah. So when you say caregiver, Kelly, I just want to make sure that everyone understands how it's defined in the context of your program or your approach or what Cleveland is doing.
Sure.
How are they defining it?
So we worked with a bunch of different communities. So we certainly worked with people who work in a hospital, and whether that is doctors, nurses, administrators, anyone who is in that space. We worked with people who are caring for often their own relatives at home. We worked with domestic folk whose jobs suddenly include caregiving when maybe they've never had any experience in working with someone who might have dementia, say, or something like that. So we've worked with a variety of communities in those spaces, using these skill sets and these practices to just get them to be more effective advocates, communicators, to have more agency, and ultimately to also have more resilience, because it's like none of this is easy, and it doesn't get easier, all right? And it's never really going to be clear, and it's so context driven. Whether you're in an emergency room or you're at home or whether you're with a family member or you're with a stranger, and we're not saying there's a path. There's no single path that we're offering you. What we're doing is we're giving you a toolkit of a lot of things that you can bring into the rooms that you're in with the people you have to be in those rooms with, to attempt to make that exchange as wise, as informed as it can be. And this is just the thing that is true across the board. Not in places like theater and sports, top performers, peak performers, they all rehearse, they all practice. Yo-Yo Ma is doing scales every single day. Baseball players who are making millions of dollars play catch before the game, right? It would be ridiculous not to. And yet, in all these other spaces, whether it's attempting to make $1 million deal in a boardroom or whether it's trying to save someone's life in a hospital setting, how many people are practicing? And I'd say very few. I'd say you get some training now and again, but it's not a regular practice. And I will contest that anyone who wants to excel at the thing that they're doing, the thing they're performing, the task they're performing at, if they want to be the best, they need to practice every day.
So what do you think when you get approached by Cleveland Clinic? What do you think their issue was, or what problem do you think they were looking to solve with this type of approach?
I can say, having worked with a bunch of folks at the Cleveland Clinic, and both in Cleveland and also the group in Las Vegas, there are a wonderful set of people who understand the need to make the empathy inside those spaces more muscular. And they have other people who don't feel the same way, who they work with. But this mighty group.
Some things can be a hard sell in
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we've
So
always done it this way. There's a lot of
we've
that
always done it this
in healthcare.
way.
Yep.
A-
Mhm.
Yeah, and and great man theory. There's a lot of that going on. Uh, and we've all seen the studies in terms of the double bind of, let's say, Black women in these spaces not appreciating their pain. And our work is all about how vital it is to see the other person. And one of the things that was so useful about not just our improv experience, which is, of course, what we walk in the door with, but then having worked with the behavioral science community, is that we understand in improv, of course, the need to be others focused, to really focus on another person. But it wasn't until we were working with the scientists that we started to understand the complexity of that. So there's a guy named William Swan, who's a scientist down in Texas, and he came up with a thing called self-verification theory. And this just blew me away when I learned about it, because it really changed how I think about this idea of being others focused. And the idea here is that most of us think we want to be seen as our prettiest selves, our best selves, our smartest selves. Swan says that's actually not true. We want to be seen as we see ourselves. So if I see myself as clumsy, I need you to see me as clumsy so you won't throw me a ball. But I'm a human being and I'm not going to tell you that.
Mm.
So how do you figure it out? And the only way you figure it out is by asking questions
Yeah.
and really hearing and listening to the end of the sentence and all the different things that we don't normally do when we're communicating with other people, because we're so afraid that we're not going to look good that we stop listening halfway through the sentence to think of the smart thing we're going to reply with.
Right.
And
there's
so,
something to asking questions too that people worry about. The whole there's no such thing as a dumb question, but people sometimes will preface a question with, this may be a stupid question.
yeah,
So I think just not being, just being brave to ask questions. I used to get criticized all the time for asking too many questions, and it was in the healthcare setting that I was told, Laura, you're asking, and I was heading up advertising for a health system, and I was told, Laura, you're asking too many questions to leadership and this one and this one. And I said, well, if I can't understand the business or their perspective, how can I help with this discipline of marketing to get the hospital where it needs to be and grow and whatever it might be? And I was told, if you ask too many questions, I look like I don't know what I'm doing.
Oh, fascinating.
Isn't
When
it?
the only way you're going to know how to do what you're doing is by asking a lot of
Asking
questions.
questions, right. But here's the great thing of that. When you think your weaknesses are really weaknesses, they're really not. So I get paid now to ask people questions in market research, Kelly. So,
Yeah, great.
sometimes you got to turn that around, and hopefully that's what I did. But yeah, I mean, you're right from the standpoint of what's the next thing I'm going to say so I look smart or whatever. I think questions make people look smarter sometimes than the things that they say, like their statements that they make
Yeah.
there.
And people want to be they want to be understood and they want to be seen. And so if you're really trying to get to that place, that feels good for the recipient. They're not, unless you're interrogating them, and there's easy ways to make sure it's not an interrogation.
Right.
And so that's also understanding. And this is where our theater training at Second City is so important. So what is your body language? What's the status you're walking into this room? Are there ways to even the status? We're recording this and I'm in my office at Second City and I'm behind a desk and my desk is a little bit high and I have two chairs over here. And if I need to have a conversation, a sensitive conversation, or get someone to open up to me, I don't stay behind the desk.
Mhm.
I move to the chair where I am on the same level of them. I recognize not just my status in my office, but my status of how I'm placed in my office. And that's true where we are everywhere, especially if we're lying in a bed, if we're vulnerable and we can't move.
Mhm.
But it is so important that the only way I'm going to be getting out of that bed is if this person, this professional, this healthcare professional in front of me can really be treating me correctly, which is then understanding, what is it I'm feeling? What is I sensing? We when this all happened, my wife Ann and I, worked on this program, I immediately had flashbacks to, my parents and my mom in particular who had dementia and all the ways I didn't sort of deal with that well. And then tragically, our daughter Nora got diagnosed with cancer when she was 16, and we were flung into this world. And so suddenly we're like, okay, I guess we use the techniques that we helped develop for other people, for ourselves.
Yeah.
And we did. And, we had, we were at Lurie Children's Hospital here in Chicago for a year before Nora passed. And as tragic, as terrible as that whole situation was, we just had the best caregivers. And in part because we allowed ourselves to be functioning at the best that we could function, and we allowed them to function in the best way they could function. So they knew if there was a mistake in the meds, that we all felt comfortable bringing it up, because we're not going to sue them. We're just trying to get something correct, and everything's so complex.
Yeah.
And that was a thing that we constantly dealt with. And like, we're cool. Let's just figure it out together. And everyone kind of knew that. And like to this day, Nora's nurses text me, whether it's on her birthday or they see something in the wild that reminds them of her. And so those relationships were really important. They were important to her. It made her feel at the worst time that she felt seen and loved.
Yeah. And being in a healthcare situation or having some kind of healthcare event really is one of the worst times in anyone's life, whether you're the patient or you're the family, whatever it might be. And I'm not big on people who have road rage and speed and whatever, but if somebody's a little hyper in a parking lot of a hospital and they're not using signals to turn into a lane or find a parking space, I give those people the benefit of the doubt that there's something going on, that they're not thinking clearly and they need some grace and space, and hopefully they don't cause an accident. But I'm just saying there's other things going through your mind at that point. And I think just to know that there's the human factor of healthcare. It does exist. And if you can find healthcare professionals that can lose the ego and actually step back and listen, you're in a lucky situation. But unfortunately, that's not the case in a lot of healthcare organizations. And you can blame it on being short-staffed. You can blame it on a whole bunch of things. But that's I think the roughest situation that anyone can be in, where you're vulnerable, the whole family's vulnerable. And if you don't have someone to come with you and listen for you, it's even a harder situation.
We have a phrase in our work. We talk about replacing blame with curiosity, because it's very easy to go to the blame. But when you go to that level of curiosity, you're in a very different space. And another phrase we have is you have to play the scene you're in, not the scene you want to be in. Like, we didn't want to be there. We didn't want this to be happening to her, to us, to our family, but we were there. And so we tried to stay fiercely present in the moment with whoever we were with, give them our attention, give them our care. And we expected it in return. And guess what? It mostly came back that way. People will treat you well when you treat them well. People will understand if they're being listened to, and they will often grant you the ability to be listened to.
Yeah.
That's my experience over and over again. I remember we wrote, and I helped us with this. After Nora passed, it was a thing was going on. It was when the detention camps, and we're finding all the sort of, kids were in these camps, and we wrote an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune, and the metaphor we used was at Lurie, the elevator doors, they closed really fast, and everyone understood this. And when you're at a city hospital like that, you're in an elevator with people speaking Spanish, people in hijab, other people whose faces are covered. The one thing we all did for each other was we extended that arm to stop the elevator until everyone was on or everyone was off. And everyone did it, whether they spoke the same language or they looked like that. And it was like, that is the approach we need to take. At that point we were saying, in this country, with everyone, because certainly in that hospital setting, there was a great, evener for everyone, which is we're all there because our child was in danger. Everyone's child was in danger. And of course we were going to do that with each other. Of course we were. But that should be the way we always are. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't just be in a children's hospital.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the articles that you had sent me from the Aspen Institute, I think it was, and there was a quote there that said 97% of the decisions made in healthcare organizations are not clinically related.
Yeah. Is that wild?
That is wild. Where did that stat come from, and what's your experience, Kelly?
I did a talk in New York for one of the hospital systems, and I'm blanking on the name, but it'll probably come to me. It's a big one. And I was talking to them about the program, and she said, there's this amazing stat. And I'm like, you have to send me, like, I need to verify this, and I did. And if you think about it, it actually makes perfect sense, which is when we're making decisions throughout a day, we're deciding, what pen we're going to pick up. We decide where we're going to write something, how we're going to hand someone to something. So in a hospital, just to run the place, plumbing, like all these, the bulk of those decisions are not necessarily what's happening in the room between a doctor and a patient. There's just, and so it speaks to the complexity of the world that we live in and the complexity in those buildings, and the idea that you really need to be aware of everything that is going on around you, that the environment is informing how decisions are going to be made. So one of the things I loved about Cleveland Clinic, in Cleveland in particular, and again, I've done a bunch of talks there and have so many friends who work there, was that, it's probably not as vibrant as it was, 7, 8 years ago, but there was so much attention to art and music on a daily level inside that building that you would hear music every single day. They programmed live music every single day. And it wasn't just that they bring in someone who could play the cello. It's like some of the nurses played music and some of the patients played music. And there was this importance that was on there. And I'm like, this is incredible, because the opposite of that, when you're in one of these settings, and I think you probably know this, is just horrifying beeps. It is not good sound.
Right.
It's scary sound. And they were basically taking that back through the beauty of music and art as well, and dance and other things that they did there. And that is, all of that is of a piece of we have to recognize the amount of the noise that exists in any particular situation that is getting in the way of us seeing the truth, or of us taking care of each other, of us understanding actually what's going on. Mm-hmm. We are bombarded with noise. And as you were talking about it, even at the beginning of this episode, like, well, what's going on in your world? I mean, have the last 2 weeks been noisy for you? Because I mean, we had. I live in Chicago. We had 2 tornado warnings in the city of Chicago for the last 2 nights, which I've lived here my whole life. I don't ever recall.
Yeah.
And that's going on, not to mention the political situation in the world, and, in our country, in our world, in our city. Not to mention business problems, or health problems, or, family members' health problems, or money problems, or whatever it is. So, understand the noise, because we are fighting against that as we're all trying to sort of collectively do this thing together.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not something I think gets talked enough about.
Yeah. Kelly, I want to step back a little bit. And for those so I was a bit of a thespian in grammar, or partly grammar school and high school, and really wanted to go to the Goodman School of Theater there at DePaul. But my dad, who was a brilliant CPA who actually graduated from DePaul, said, no way am I going to pay for my daughter's theater school, because you need to be able to survive and pay your bills one day. So not everyone, though, understands what improv is all about. So I'd love to take a step back and ask you to explain a little bit about improv, and maybe a little history or your philosophy of improv, and then maybe you'll give more context to how your program works in the healthcare setting.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I go talk places, one of the first things I say is that improvisation is yoga for your social skills,
Mhm.
and that improvisation is like loud, noisy group mindfulness, and that improv is a practice in being unpracticed, which is how all of us walk through the world.
Yeah.
And
Does
I
everyone's
say
head explode when they
everyone's head
hear
explodes,
that?
and then I add and I go, if that surprises you, it might not if you knew the origin story of improvisation,
Yeah.
as it works in this country for Second City in particular. And it starts in the 20s and 30s at Jane Addams Hull House on the south side of Chicago. And there was a woman by the name of Viola Spolin. She was a social worker. And her job was to better integrate the immigrant children and the neighborhood children who were coming into her care. So she created all these improv games, many of which were in gibberish or silence because the kids didn't always share language. But they would allow the kids to get up on a stage and collaborate and communicate and connect. And her son, Paul Sills, was studying at the University of Chicago at the time. And he taught these games to his friends, people like Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Alan Arkin, Barbara Harris. And they formed the first improvisational theater in the country. It was called the Compass Players. It was in 1955. And by 1959, that morphs into the Second City. So what Second City does is we use these games to train our people. And they are often like listening games and matching games and mirroring exercises, all those sorts of things. And then there are performance games as well that we can do in front of audiences. Now we use them at Second City to create sketch comedy reviews. So if you've seen Saturday Night Live, that all
Mhm.
came out of the Second City. That first cast was half Second City people. We do short and somewhat longer sketch comedy scenes and a 2-act review, but there's almost always a third act that's an improv set, which is where we're developing material and playing that out. We started in 1959. You name some of the people I worked with, but other people who came out of the Second City include like Fred Willard and Joan Rivers and John Belushi and Gilda
Mhm.
Radner and John Candy and Martin Short. I mean, there is no other institution in the world that has had as just vast legacy of comedic talent that got its start as a place like Second City. And we have theaters in Chicago and Toronto and a new one in New York City in Brooklyn. And we've been doing this for it'll be our 65th anniversary
Wow.
coming up in December. And so
Congratulations. That's so
yeah, it's
cool.
amazing. And so in addition to the theaters, we have the largest school of improvisation, the Second City Training Center. And then about 30 years ago, we started Second City Works, which is our group that works with organizations and corporate clients. So we'll do training and we'll do content creation and advertising and all different kinds of services that we do for those folks. And we've got other things we do in terms of television and new media and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's been, I feel very blessed. I started here in 1988 as a dishwasher. It was my first gig out of college.
Holy
Uh,
cow. Wow. You
yep.
didn't start off as a comedian or
No, I wanted to be a player. I wanted to be a very serious playwright. And
wow.
the advice I was given by theater professionals was if you wanted to work in a theater, just get a job in a theater, whether it's tearing tickets or in my case, washing dishes. David Mamet did that at one point at Second City early in his career. And the other guy who got hired as a dishwasher the same week with me was Jon Favreau, the film director. So
Wow.
we both had mullets, and there's photographic evidence in my wife's office at Second
Well,
City.
well, we know how far back mullets go, Kelly. So
Yes, we do. And there might have been an ear cuff. I'm not, admitting it completely. Might have been.
oh my gosh. So when you talk about improv and these games or these
Mhm.
exercises, at the end of the day, what are they really meant to do? Because I remember when there would be improv exercises in my theater classes, it was about being, well, for us anyway, it was about thinking on your feet and being creative with the next thing. And some of it was about storytelling and some of it was about being funny. But at the end of the day, in a business setting or a healthcare setting, what does how does that translate, I guess,
Yeah.
into that kind of setting?
Every game and every exercise, and I'm talking about there are different schools of improvisation, which is way too nerdy that we don't need to get into. But Viola Spolin is often considered the mother of improvisation. She wrote the book Improvisation for the Theater. So those games, it depends where you put the point of focus.
Hmm.
So every exercise or every game can probably teach you 25, 30 different things, depending on where you put the point of focus. So With one exercise, it can be about listening. And another exercise, it can be about status. In another exercise, it could be about leadership. It all depends where you put the point of focus. And then, part of what happens is when groups of people play the games together, they become an ensemble. That's the word we use. Other people would say team. Sheldon Patinkin, who's one of the sort of gurus of Second City, often would use this example of saying, people think that your team is only as good as its weakest member. He said, that's not true. Your team is only as good as its ability to compensate for its weakest member, because each of us is going to be the weakest member at one point. So let's know what our strengths are. Let's know what our weaknesses are. Let's make sure that the person who, is the best actor is doing the acting roles, and the person who gets the best improviser is doing more of the improv, or whatever it is. And so an ensemble is strengthened by its diversity, and it's understanding that all those different parts are interconnected. So you can see this absolutely in a healthcare setting when you have nurses who work so well with surgeons who are then open to the advice of the person with the anesthesia or whatever. They work as a unit, and they have to. I certainly had the benefit of seeing both, really high functioning teams and low functioning teams. And over the course of I host this podcast, Getting the ESAN, and I get to talk to all kinds of interesting people. And one of my favorite guests, she's been on twice, is Amy Edmondson, who is the Harvard professor who coined the term psychological safety. And this is all based by studies she did in hospitals do you know this story?
I
The
don't.
original origin
No.
Check this out.
Cool.
So she was a postdoc, and she was working with a very prominent scientist at the time who was trying to finish up this gig for this Boston, it was near Boston hospital. And he asked her help to finish it. And they were studying these nursing pods, and they were trying to figure out, because the data didn't seem correct, because what the data was showing them was that the nursing groups where people were kind of mean to each other, bossy with each other, didn't listen to each other, they had the least mistakes of anyone. And then the nursing pods where people were respectful to each other and listened to each other, they made the most mistakes.
Huh.
And Amy's like, this just doesn't jive.
Yeah.
So she said, would you be okay if I basically hired an observer? We won't tell anyone they're there. That's just going to go in and observe what's going on. And they did. And when this person came back with their data, what they recognized that it wasn't that the dysfunctional nursing teams made the least mistakes. They reported the least mistakes.
Oh.
The
Wow.
high functioning teams had the psychological safety to know, yep, let's let people know when we make mistakes so we don't make another mistake.
Mm.
And that's at the essence of this idea of psychological safety, which is, high functioning teams need to be able to be honest about when they get it wrong so that they can then get it right, because part of getting it wrong is what learning is.
Yeah. There's a lot of ego there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fear. There's
Yeah.
a lot of fear, and not well-earned fear.
Mhm.
Fear that makes perfect sense given a lot of the environments, whether it's a family environment or a work environment or a school environment,
Absolutely.
where we were told to shut up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I was reading about is it Katie Watson and the improv training program. I had read here that I think she said something like improv, healthcare professionals need to prepare for unpredictability, which I feel like that's minute by minute.
Yeah, sure is.
Setting. So what
Yeah.
is it about improv that could help healthcare workers feel either safer in their jobs from a communication standpoint, or
Sure.
their interactions even with colleagues, physicians? There's all kinds of points of communication at any given time, but what is it about improv that can help the unpredictability response, I guess, let's just call it?
Well, the first thing is you don't have a script. So if you do not have a script, you have to learn how to work without a script. And one of the things that we teach at Second City, and ended up being the title of my book, is this idea of you need to walk in with a yes and mindset. And what that means is when someone offers you something, your response is to accept it, whatever it is, and then add to it, and not to judge it, and not to negate it, but it doesn't. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to even completely understand it. All those things. But if you can accept what's being said and add to it, that begins a very pro-social way of you extending this communication and then building something out of nothing, because that's what we're all doing. We're building something out of nothing. So if you start with the yes and mindset, that's it. And then in improvisation, you learn, we have an exercise called last word. And that's where we'll pair two people. We'll say, you're going to have a conversation, can be about anything. The one rule is that you have to start your sentence with the last word the other person said. And you go do that. And people quickly sort of figure out like, oh, wow, I actually have to listen to the end of this person's sentence. And you recognize that we don't normally do that. And then also there's no other like rules that we gave you. It doesn't mean that because, you end with the word, orange, I can start with the word orange and I can say whatever I want afterwards. I didn't give you a rule beyond that. I'm just trying to get you to listen to the end of the sentence. So you figure out that there's a dynamics going on between all of our interpersonal communication that probably stand in the way of it being effective or true. And the thing of why improvisation makes such great comedy is because it is surprising. And in part, it's surprising because it's true. And so it's like, wow, that's unusual. It's like, yeah, that's not the way it normally goes, but it does if you try this technique. And great comedy is that uncovering of like, and so often when you see comedy you love, it's like, oh my God, you're saying the thing I think, but I could never say.
Yeah.
Or you're exhibiting the behavior that we've all seen. I know that behavior. I know what's going to happen. And it's funny to us. But it is funny because it's true. I'm married to a tenured professor of comedy. So my wife, Ann Libra, runs the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance. And she's got a book coming out at Northwestern University Press next year called Funnier, which is about her sort of comedy theory. And one of the things that she talks about is that all comedy is kind of these elements that are on a mixing board, and it is pain and distance and recognition. So there's always some element of pain in comedy. Otherwise, it's not going to end up being funny, but that requires distance. So when I make a joke about something, it might be physical distance, like this thing happened in New York, but I'm in Chicago, so it's okay. Or it could be, that we've all heard the phrase too soon, and we're seeing this play out right now. People are too quick with their jokes, and not good. And then recognition is often the element that people don't understand, which is we also laugh at things because we recognize them. And sometimes that's true. And she used to call it truth, and she changed it to recognition because that's what it is. So we might see a character in the first act of something show up in the second act. And we're like, oh, I see that character again. And there's nothing funny about it except that you recognize it. So all those things are kind of on a mixing board that you're playing with. And if you think about what theater is in general, not just comedy, but all theater it's a reflection of the human experience. And improvisation are practices to get you really good and really salient at representing the human experience. We're like, oh, we could practice that for our play. We could also practice that for our life. So how about that? How cool would that be? The thing that we're actually doing day to day, we could be better at. We could have better experiences with our spouse and with our kids if we listen to them, if we affirm them. If we're not constantly in a high status situation and we're able to lower our status on occasion, that we have a phrase in our work that all of us are better than one of us. That is the attitude we're going in, because when you're improvising on stage without a script, my job is to save you and your job is to save me. And we both know it. And when we both know it, anything can happen.
Yeah. And Kelly, can you speak to the elements of Katie's medical improv training program, kind of the highlight?
Yeah, Katie's a dear friend. She studied at Second City and an incredibly accomplished human being. She had led the ACLU for a while, and she's a doctor, and she's like, just like overachiever.
Wow.
But it's all the things I'm talking about. So we're all we're all swimming in the same water. We're just kind of doing it maybe a little bit differently. But she takes these tenets of improvisation and teaches them primarily to physicians to improve their listening skills and improve their ability to collaborate. As we've mentioned a couple times in this podcast in various ways, there's a lot of ego because there's a lot of people who have accomplished great accomplishments in their life, and they spend a lot of money to get there, and they've studied at some of the top schools. And I get it. That tends to make you puff you up a little bit and can give you a series of high status behaviors. But just living your life with just high status behaviors is going to take you farther and farther and farther away from actually seeing what's going on in the world. And there's so much social science to back this up in terms of, people with a lot of money and a great deal of success have a much harder idea of understanding what's actually happening in a room with everyone else who doesn't have that. When it is dependent on people without those things, their day-to-day survival is dependent on them understanding the dynamics inside a room. So those are all things that we teach, and part of the joy about medical improv is that the exercises are fun and they do provoke humor and laughter. And that is not separate from learning. That's actually part of the learning. We learn when we laugh. We learn when we move. This is the tragedy of our educational systems is sit still. Why? That's a barrier to learning. Why are you inflicting a barrier to learning? Let them move. Let them play. Play and games essential to how we have always learned from the beginnings of civilization.
Yeah.
I just interviewed Kelly Clancy, and my podcast with her is coming on in 2 weeks, and she's a neuroscientist who just did this exhaustive history of games. And it is just fascinating. And she's like, I always wondered why people don't take games seriously when, you think about game theory and war games. It's like, we do take it seriously in certain domains, but we have to attach this other thing to them. And it's a really wonderful book. And it makes you understand how serious play is and how important it is to human development, not just in children. And that's one of the problems, right? It's that thing that, like, when you stop learning, when you stop playing, and often, I've seen studies that often we do rediscover it, but not until retirement. And that's not good. That's not good.
It's not. I think I told you that I'm a certified facilitator in the Lego serious play method, which is my Lego head guy back there. And I had never touched a Lego in my life, being a girl. That's just wasn't part of what was in the toolbox or the toy box, really.
Toy box.
In my toy box, but now it's a tool in my toolbox for work and what I do with moderating. But yeah, it was so fascinating that bricks could actually solve problems and be able to think beyond your own little world that you've been in, and you come into this world of bricks and your own ideas and your own thoughts, and the focus is not on you, it's on the model or the build, and it kind of democratizes the process of everyone gets to talk. And I think a lot of communication, the way it stands today, whether it's healthcare or anywhere else, we're so afraid to say things now too. We're so guarded. We might think we have the most well-intended statement that's going to come out of our mouth, and it rubs someone the wrong way, and you can't always help that. But I think we're all, in some ways, we're not afraid to say things because social media has let that happen. But in a more of a personal one-on-one communication setting, I think people are really guarded. And maybe with physician these days too, they're so afraid to say certain things with a patient about a diagnosis or a prognosis or any of that.
Well, I have two thoughts. One is games are models of the world. They're the models of how, that's how we learn to negotiate. That's how we learn to manage conflict. That's how we understand the resilience we need when we lose, and also the humility of what we might need to, how we might need to respond when we win. And then the other thing about that kind of honest communication. So my dear friend Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor, Second C's partnered with her on a few different programs. But part of that is this her theory, which is you want radical candor, which means you care personally, and you're honest and can give direct feedback. But the person is only going to hear that honest, direct feedback if they know you care personally. Otherwise, you're just being obnoxious, and she calls it obnoxious aggression. And there's other elements inside her grid. But one of the things I loved about working with Kim and her thoughts is that feedback can be hard, but it is so less hard when the person across from you knows that you give a shit,
Right.
and that you're there for them, and that's not that hard to build over time. I'm really blessed with in the last few years, I've had a couple of probably the best bosses I've ever had in my career at Second City, and in both cases, they are people who I truly took the time to know me and know what I care about and what I value. And that is always number one in terms of that. And Jalili, who's been, she was my boss for a while. She isn't right now, though. She still kind of is. But she would always do these things with me. She's like, let's go take a walk. And we would literally go for a walk to figure something out together. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I can't, you're so smart about doing this. You're getting me moving. You're getting you moving. We're paying attention. We're laughing. We go get an ice cream cone or something. And then we have that. And by the time we get back, we solved whatever problem it was. I'm like, how did that work?
Yeah.
And it's just like, she's like, I know you. You just need to get outside and I don't need to figure it out for you. You're going to figure it out. And it's just very funny because we've got that relationship. And the other thing that, I think I helped her with, which is I'm very, especially since Nora died, or maybe because Nora died. I am an open book. I am going to tell you if my toe is hurt, you're going to hear that my toe is hurt because it's going to affect the way I walk into a room. If I'm happy about something, you're going to know that. And I'm generally a pretty upbeat person, so there's a lot of that too.
Yeah.
And that was not something that she was used to in a business setting, but it became sort of like this shift, and it allowed her also to be able to come in and be like, my dog's sick and I'm worried. I'm like, yeah, let's talk. I love, my dog's sick. Let's talk, whatever. And it just allows us then to not leave ourselves at the doorstep of our work, but we really do bring ourselves in. And I'm not going to say our whole selves. We bring the parts of ourselves that matter, that are important to us being as successful as we can be in our day, and as happy and as fulfilled and as meaningful and purposeful as we can be in our day. This is why we're here. We only get so many days. Why would you not try to make the days as incredible as you can? And you can only do that if you've got the cooperation of the people around you. So it also means tending to these relationships.
Yeah.
And when you tend to those relationships, people know you care. You can be honest with them. They can be honest with you. And guess what? It still doesn't make anything like work beautifully. It's the dysfunction is still there, but it's so much better. Exactly. It's a better kind of dysfunction.
Exactly. Kelly, let's pretend a minute.
Yeah.
Let's pretend I'm the CEO of a big healthcare system, which includes a few hospitals, medical group, off-site facilities, all of that, the whole shebang of a big healthcare system. Let's say I'm the CEO.
Yep.
And I hear about Improv for healthcare, and you're the guy who's pitching the CEO. How do you position that in terms of the benefits and the benefits of a program like this, and a CEO who's so numbers focused on growth and margins and patient satisfaction scores and employee satisfaction scores, and if we don't hit these certain scores on the report card, we get paid less through CMS. All these things that a CEO might be thinking, and here comes Kelly and his little improv theater, program. How do you pitch that to a CEO?
I love that you added his little improv program. We have an exercise that does that.
That's what I figured people say about the Lego bricks. Like, I'm going to pay someone for 8 hours to play with bricks. So I'm the CEO, Kelly. What do you tell me about your program and what problem it can solve for me?
Well, probably before I walked in the door, I tried to know as much about you as possible. And let's say that you went to the University of Michigan. You're gonna bet I'm gonna lay down some University of Michigan stuff so that you are connecting with me in a way that's beyond numbers.
Yeah.
That's about how can we make it so that there's two human beings in the room talking to each other.
Yeah.
And then
On a side note too, Kelly, for the salespeople out there who are listening, this might be
yeah,
good
you could it's
information
useful.
too. Yeah.
You know, pick a couple of things.
Yeah.
And remember this, specifics are your friend. Nothing is funny because it's vague, and nothing got accomplished because it was vague. A question I often ask people in positions of power who are going to write us a check or not is your success, your overall success, dependent on human beings working well with other human beings?
Hmm.
And I've never had the answer not be yes. I'm like, that's what we do. We make human beings work better with other human beings. Now, very specifically, what that means is that you need people to be peak performers. And how do they achieve peak performance? They achieve peak performance through practice. But it's not a bunch of role playing. Like the great teams, let's say you like sports, the great teams didn't just scrimmage all the time. Anyone who follows a particular sport knows that there are very specific drills that they run. And that's what we do. We run people through drills that give them the ability to try on what it means to listen effectively, and also listen ineffectively. What does it mean to speak clearly? What does it mean to support? How does support feel? And remember, improvisation is embodied practice. So you are feeling the thing as well as, it's not just the thing coming in the brain. It's also, how does this feel in my body? So when you said just, there's an exercise we have called just or little. And so what we say is, I would have you in a minute tell me, who you are. And I'd repeat it back to you, but saying, oh, you're just this little, you just do this little Lego thing where you bring in your little toys and you just do, and you realize that those words, just and little, are terrible.
Mhm.
They are diminutive and they lessen you. And so we say, like, you have to also be aware that your language and the words you use are being heard in maybe a way you didn't intend. Hopefully you didn't intend. So with any of these, and look, I worked at a second city many, many years ago where people would laugh us out of the room thinking that we could go, help them, these big corporations. We work with the Fortune 100. It's like we are, it is not unusual. And most of these CEOs get it because especially now, because their workforces do not know how to talk to each other.
Correct.
They're seeing this play out in real time and they don't know what to do. And by the way, it's happening at their universities too. And that they went to, and maybe they donate to, and they're seeing it there, and they're seeing it with their new employees. And guess what? The blame game isn't going to work. It is just not going to work. What's going to work is new styles of communicating with each other and appreciating the differences of different generations. And I have a son who's 26, so my son is a Shakespearean actor. So his parents said, "Go for it."
I can only imagine the dinner conversations.
Oh yeah,
Conversations on holidays.
Yeah, it's exactly what you would imagine in my family.
Yeah.
But Nick and a bunch of his friends, I mean, like, they're going to save the world as far as I'm concerned. I look at them and they care and they're smart and they work hard. They also have bullshit detectors that, we didn't have. And I'll give you a good example of this, which is when COVID happened and George Floyd and all that's going on, and Second City, went from 700 employees to 38.
Well,
and we made it and we came back. And we're all sort of like, well, we kind of got to reevaluate where we are. And I remembered that there was an adage, a theater adage that I took great pride in, and most of my compatriots took great pride in, and that was this term, the show must go on. And there was a point, and I think I was sitting in this very office where I just kind of slumped in my chair and went, oh my God, the people who were invested in the show must go on were the rich, wealthy producers who needed the people with less money, the performers, to go on no matter what, so they didn't stop getting paid. And the show doesn't. COVID was an example of the show didn't go on.
Yeah.
Because it couldn't go on. And sometimes the show can't go on. And that is just fundamentally has created a different environment in my field. And this is not just Second City. This is the entire theater industry deals with this now, which is when people are sick, they don't come to work. And we used to always come to work when we were sick.
Right. I know. You wouldn't dare miss a day because to call the boss to say, I'm sick.
Yeah. Not unless you broke a leg. And even then you're probably in the afternoon.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
So not healthy, not healthy. So,
but definitely with new generations coming into the healthcare system as well, the communication styles definitely have changed there as well among healthcare professionals and even doctors coming in, and the requirements for medical school and the curriculum that has changed a lot also. But Kelly, the systems that you work with, how are they measuring a program like yours in terms of success? What does success look like? What, again, healthcare systems are very outcomes focused. So how do they look at something like your program?
I mean, there's a fair amount of surveying that people do at different times, and that goes on. But there's also, we have the benefit of being in Chicago, which there's a few things happening there, which is there's a huge community here.
Yeah.
And people know Second City.
Right.
And at this point, they know our stuff. So it is, and they all talk to each other. So we've done enough stuff at Lurie and at Rush and at Northwestern. We've worked with everyone. And so at this point, there's so much less of that sort of convincing. Now, the harder part is it's very easy to get booked, once a year, twice a year to come in. I think it should be more. I'd like to figure out ways to do that because people need the ongoing practice. So that's always something we're looking at. But I think for most institutions, they're also measuring with their eyes and their ears, and how are their teams, functioning after a session with us. And almost universally, it's like, oh man, they were great, but they're probably great for the next few weeks. And then it starts to atrophy off. So that's the missing link here. That's the thing that if I'm looking at what's next for this sort of program, it's like, how do we turn this into yoga? When I was growing up, no one was walking around with mats.
Right.
Right? You didn't see that.
No.
And then you live in any city, you live in any urban city in America, and there's women walking around with the mats every single morning, every afternoon, and they're going to their local yoga spot. And it makes great sense.
Was just for hippies way back when.
Yes.
Right?
And now it is, but there's evidence, right? I mean, there's science behind why it's good for you. And the same thing exists with improv. We just got to figure out how to scale it. That's what I want to do. I want to scale it.
Yeah, I love it. Kelly, I love this healthcare conversation, and I know we can go on forever, but I have to get in just one really good Second City story, like from your favorite comedian that came out of Second City from, the original group and ended up on SNL. Give me your favorite story.
All right, this is one of my favorites. It's a leadership story. The application I can do straight on it, and leadership at every level, and it'll make sense when I talk about it. So, in the early 90s, when I started producing here, and this is maybe mid 90s, mid to late 90s, there were a couple of actresses in one of the Second City casts, and Tina Fey was one of them, and the other was the star of the cast. So Tina, no one knew Tina Fey when she was here at Second City. Everyone knew Rachel Dratch. People came specifically to see Rachel Dratch at Second City. She just, the audiences loved her. They adored her. And she and Tina both auditioned for Saturday Night Live. Rachel doesn't get it. And Tina doesn't get an acting gig. She gets hired for the writing staff. And Rachel's bereft because of those days, the sort of golden rule at Saturday Night Live, it's different now, but back then, if you didn't get hired in an audition, you'll never get hired. That you were off the table. So Tina has a very successful year on the writing staff at SNL. And that summer, the head writer, Adam McKay, also a Second City alum, decides to step down. And they give the job to Tina to become head writer of SNL. So the season's over. Tina's got this new gig that she'll start the following year. And she calls me and she says, hey, for this, I'm coming home for the summer. I want to do a 2-woman show with Dratch. Do you got a space where I could do it? And I'm like, yeah, we have a space that's dark on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, meaning there wasn't a regular show. So I'm like, yeah, do your show there. Again, no one knows Tina at this point. She was just on the writing staff. She wasn't doing Weekend Update. But she was the new head writer for SNL. And so Tina and Rachel do the show Dratch and Faye, which is maybe the funniest sketch show I've ever seen in my life. There's a grainy version on YouTube that you can find that's worth watching. But here's the thing, which is every summer, Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live, and his other producers would come and scout at Second City to look for talent. So they'd always see the main stage show. They'd often see the ETC show. What Tina knew was that there was no way Lorne Michaels wasn't going to see his new head writer's 2-woman show. Saw it. Rachel was incredible. And they offered a job to Rachel after seeing that show.
Oh boy.
Tina did that. And it's the reason it's a leadership story is it is how Tina leads. Tina leads from underneath. So anyone who's a fan of 30 Rock, Tina was the boss at 30 Rock, head writer, star of the show. She's not going to be louder than Alec Baldwin or Tracy Morgan or any of those clowns, but she didn't need to be. She let them be loud and she led with a lower status.
Yeah.
And she's done that everywhere. And I've myriad examples of her doing that with me, where it'd be a sort of a gentle, like, have you ever thought about this is a stupid idea. Maybe you do this. And I'm like, no, oh, that's a good idea. It's like, oh no, you knew it was the best idea all along.
Yeah.
Like my ego needed it to be like, no, yeah, I'm still in charge. It's all good. You're not in charge. But it's an amazing thing. And Rachel kind of thought nothing was going to happen for her. And then it did. And she's, everyone has gone on to incredible careers.
Yeah.
And I just, I love that. And I love that about true improvisers who really are looking out for each other. That's what they do.
Yeah. That's pretty cool that the girl on the stage didn't need to be on the stage. As far as her style. That's pretty cool.
Yep.
Well, Kelly, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. Very enlightening, and I hope the healthcare folks who are listening out there take some of this to heart. And with, again, healthcare being a rough place to be, I think that improv is certainly highly beneficial in terms of communication styles, et cetera, and just working with patients in a different way. Because, as you know, when it's the worst time of your life, you're whatever it is, treatment, whatever it is, rough going, but it's the way you were treated by people that really makes the difference. And Kelly, where can folks learn more about you and your program?
They can either come to our website, secondcity.com or secondcityworks.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn. That's where I post all the podcasts and articles and information on different kinds of events that we do. So look me up.
Yeah, sounds great. All right. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, everyone, again, for listening. This is another episode of the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. Stay well and keep pushing for answers.
Oh my goodness, that's a wrap on another compelling story. Thanks for listening to the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. If you would like more information about today's guests or to find out more about Laura, me, go to desperateforadiagnosis.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow show updates and healthcare news on the podcast's Facebook page. If you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions, advice, or suggestions for our guests, please email me at lauramarie@desperateforadiagnosis.com.